Hello everyone, I'm Filmos and this is another devlog of Project Blickward, and this video will be adding enemies as well as their attacks, so there is some kind of danger and reason to play it. We'll be also adding a way to fight back and a way to kill those enemies. But before we get into the coding, there's one technical thing that I probably should explain, and that is the development run of the project. So what I mean by that? I mean that there will be 3 stages, prototype, in which we are testing how the behavior should look like, and we are trying out many different things just to see what works, what's fun and what's enjoyable and what is just wrong. It also allows us to see some problems that we didn't anticipate. Then there's the demo stage, which is just the same thing we did with the prototype, but more refined, like a more final version. So it's basically just a portion of the whole game, but a portion that is the way it's supposed to be. And then there is the release stage when it's just the full game. So currently we are on the prototype stage. Now, why is that important? Because of the engine that we are using. For the prototyping, we need an engine which will allow us to quickly do major changes to the way things are done and not force us to work too much into detail. And for that I'm using Construct. However, Construct isn't really suitable for the final release because of the many limitations that it has. So for the demo stage we'll be using Unity. So all of the coding segments that you will see in this video are made still in Construct because we are still at the prototyping stage. However, in the future, once we finish the prototype and we'll get into working on the demo, I'll be coding in Unity. So now that we got that out of the way, let's start with implementing enemies. So the first thing we'll need is sprites. And we actually need 2 sets of sprites for each enemy. In addition to the base sprite, we'll also need a sprite for the eyes, so that they can glow in the dark and so that we can change their color if we want to. The second sprite just needs to be a white shape at a proper position and with a lot of transparency. For the base sprites, I used already created textures by Son Danielson. I picked 3 different characters, each with different eye shape, so that they can be distinguished just by the look of their eyes. Then I had to create those eyes masks, which was simply drawing over a new layer in the shape that was already created. But then I realized that there is one simple flaw with the system, and that is when the enemy is facing upwards. Then the eyes are not visible, which is going to be really problematic. So to fix that, I added to each of the characters eye on the back of their head. This way, even if they are facing upwards, you can still see them in the dark. Now this looks a bit weird, so it will definitely need to be reworked for the demo stage, but for the prototype it's good enough. And this is how the sprite look in game. You can tell where the enemies are standing even in total darkness, and when you come closer you can see the rest of their shape. And with the added back eyes, you can also see when they are facing upwards. The shapes on the back of their heads are different than the ones on the front, but you can still tell which enemy is which. So now it's time to add the hardest part so far, which is pathfinding. I'm going to cheat it a little bit because I'm going to use the pathfinding that is built into Construct. However, as you can see, it's not exactly what we want, because the movement is smooth and we want the movement to be tile based. Now we can easily fix that by simply adding another sprite which will follow, and it will only update its position once the square, which is actually the pathfinding, changes to a different tile. Now this pathfinding will try to target me and will try to get as close as possible. This is not exactly what we want, because we can also add to it the line of sight. This way it will try to move until it has a line of sight to me. However, the pathfinding AI is not really changed. It will still try to move as close to me, just the change is that the line of sight will stop the pathfinding from continuing once it can see you. So it's not really the closest path towards the line of sight, but it's the closest path to you, and it will stop once the line of sight has been reached. To implement this, we just give each of the enemies its own pathfinding square and its own line of sight, and then we sync them so that when the pathfinder moves, the enemy sprites and the line of sight teleports to a appropriate tile. The line of sight is trying to look directly at the player, but then its angle is rounded to the nearest multiple of 90 degrees. When implementing this, there were a few issues with the collision system, because we don't want 2 enemies to be able to stand on the same tile. So each enemy sprite has to be a solid object. However, that also means that whenever one of the enemies move, we have to update the obstacle map of all of the enemies. And it also means that the line of sight has to ignore this specific type of solid objects, so that multiple enemies can stay on the same line of sight towards the player. There were also a few issues with finding appropriate tile for the enemy sprite to stand on, because the pathfinding square could sometimes touch another tiles which were not on the actual path. Because of that, the enemy would sometimes teleport to tiles it's not supposed to, or even to tiles that are already occupied by other enemies or even player. To fix that, I added a few additional checks to ensure that the tile the enemy is moving to is actually empty, and I also changed the order in which the enemies were updated. Instead of updating all of them each time, they are being updated in sequence. This way we can avoid the situation where two different enemies try to move on the same tile, which at the time of the movement check is actually empty. After a bit of work, the pathfinding was working. Each of the enemies tried to get line of sight towards you so that later you can shoot bullets, but it still looks a bit weird, and that is because there aren't any movement animations. So let's work on that right now. Originally, I just wanted to use the movement animations from the textures that were created. However, after seeing the teleporting enemies, I decided to do it slightly different. I wanted to keep the instant movement because it looked a bit scary and disturbing, so to make it a bit more pleasing to the eye, I just added an after image after they move. So the base sprite just teleports instantly to the final position, but the eye sprite is being spread out over the distance of the movement with a fading animation. With this added, the enemy movement looked way better. And we also kept all of the benefits of instantly teleporting hitboxes instead of having to interpolate them. So now that the enemy movement is done, let's give the player an ability to deal them some damage and eventually kill them. Implementing hit detection was pretty straightforward, however there were two different things that needed to be implemented. First of them was displaying the health that the enemy has. To do that, I used the ability to change the color of the enemy eyes, so now the less health the enemy has, the bleaker its eyes are. The other thing that needed to be implemented is the hit animation. For that, I just added some particles whenever the enemy is hit. I also added some knockback movement to increase the visual feedback. And this is how it looks in game. I have to say that even though the sprites of the enemies aren't changing by themselves, the knockback and the particles are really doing a great job. So now that we can damage the enemies, it's only fair that they can do the same to us. Because there are 3 different types of enemies, there also need to be 3 different attack patterns. The first one is a simple laser, which is a single projectile being shot towards you. The second one is a wall of projectiles, which are 3 projectiles shot at you one next to another. And the third one is the most dangerous one, which is the bomb. It shoots a single projectile, which upon reaching its destination, splits into 3 smaller ones. The destination of the bomb projectile is simply the point closest to the player when the projectile was launched. Here we come across the same problem we did while implementing enemies, and that is how to display the player's health. Because the enemies have their health displayed directly on their sprites, I decided to do something similar with the player, and I did that by splitting the player into 4 different segments. This way, I can control each of the segments independently and hide one of them whenever a point of HP is lost. This way you can easily display player's health without having to add extra HUD, however it also limits the player to the maximum of 4 health points. Because of that, we'll also need to add some invincibility frames so that the game isn't too hard. And this is how it all looks like in the end. We have enemies trying to kill us and by shooting projectiles at us. And there are those 3 projectile types that I was talking about, the wall one, the bomb, and the simple laser. We can also get hit. And we can also fight back and try to kill them. This is also the end of this devlog. Remember to subscribe if you want to be notified when the next part is uploaded. If you have any suggestions of what should be improved or added, leave them in the comment section or on our Discord server. There's a link in the description. You can also support this project on Patreon. But that will be all. See you next time.